But for now, I will turn it over to Ben Jacobs of Wittenberg and Westphalia, here to talk to you about sects.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Let me just share my screen here. So, hello, everybody, and thanks for coming. As David said, I'm host of Wittenberg to Westphalia, The Wars of the Reformation, a show about religious conflict in Europe. As such, I've been studying the subject of Christian sects for a while, and one thing has struck me from early on. I'm Jewish, as some of you may know, and so I'm kind of an outsider to all of this. But when discussing things like the Protestant Reformation with my friends or listening to the news and when things kind of come up about different sects, I often find that the myriad of sects of Christianity are presented in a manner divorced from their history or like what they actually believe. Some people treat sects as just sort of an identity label, like a sports team. Others treat them purely in terms of their modern ideology, in terms of political policies, but without any justification. I think there are reasons for this, some of which we will get to in this presentation, but I think that this is all important and honestly fascinating. So if you don't know anything about this already, the world's about to get a lot more comprehensible, I think. That said, this topic is not simple. Essentially, I'm going to attempt in the next 20 minutes to explain the entire 2,000-year history of Christianity. This is going to require some abstraction, I'm sure you understand. I'm going to open with a thesis. The disputes in this presentation generally involve a mixture of debates about theology, i.e. what the Christians actually believe, or it's about the organizational structure used to administer church resources and make choices about doctrine. The way this process is conventionally thought about is summarized neatly in the top image, which I found on the internet. A branching series of Christian traditions with breaks, splits happen between sects when believers of those traditions find that they can no longer work together and leave to form their own branch. This is a perfectly reasonable way to conceptualize the process, but I think it has some problems. Often there are long periods of stability punctuated by short periods with lots of sects being created. Not all the breaks are the same. They happen for different reasons. And so the timeline that I put together at the bottom there might maybe be a little bit more useful, but it's still an abstraction. Given the time limits involved today, I'm going to be focusing on disputes that resulted in sects that still survive, particularly in the Anglophone world. As such, I've had to be particularly brutal about the early years of the church, though they are interesting and important. Apologies. So, touching on the early church, Christological controversies were the big thing. What is the Trinity, and what's the biblical debate surrounding that? The current version is basically that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are actually the same thing, and also they are not the same thing, also at the same time. This is agreed upon by most existing sects. Arianism is a sect that no longer exists, but just to give you an idea of some of the disputes that could exist, God was Jesus's dad, and they can't be the same thing because a father and a son are different. And then everyone fought. The Nestorian, sorry about that, everybody. Slides just went wild. Don't use the track wheel. Okay. The Nestorian Christians say that Jesus, the human, can't be God. Jesus was therefore inhabited by God, and when one of the pieces of evidence for this is that when Jesus was on the cross and said, "Why have you forsaken me?" that was God leaving Jesus physically. One of the ramifications of this is that Mary didn't give birth to God. She was still very special and important, but didn't actually give birth to God. And then everybody fights. The Nestorians are still around, so we'll touch back on that in a minute. There's a few other early sects that survive. The Coptic Orthodox Church is the church of the Egyptians, the native Egyptians. There is a Christological dispute between them and the Eastern Orthodox that I do not understand. They get very mad when people say they believe the same things as the Nestorians. But they also reject the Council of Chalcedon because they say that, look, I'm not going to get into it. There's something going on there with Christology, and I'm not qualified to talk about it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church are fascinating. Ethiopian Christians were converted fairly early by the Copts, though they were only granted autocephaly in 1959. Despite this, they developed as extremely different religions. The Tuedo have 81 biblical books, basically any book that came along that the other different types of Christianity may have rejected for their Bible. The Ethiopians took it into theirs. So that's completely fascinating. A very, very interesting tradition. Okay. So to explain how a bunch of what's about to happen, we need to talk about organizational structures. The idea of bishops came to the church fairly early, within the first 100 years or so of Christianity existing. Are you guys seeing my notifications on your screens? I don't want that to happen. Okay. Well, anyway, hopefully that's not happening. Okay. So bishops, sort of a unitary leader of each geographic region that administered church resources and made decisions about doctrine. So that was all settling into place within the first 100 years. How these people were selected and what to do when disputes happened were unclear. What eventually happened, what was eventually decided, theoretically, was that each community elected a local bishop for governance. Some of those bishops had extra power where they got to make decisions about regional disputes. These became archbishops. The archbishops, in turn, sought advice when they had disputes from patriarchs. The patriarchs were also elected locally, so they're all just bishops. It's just some of them have special powers granted by the particular patch of land they happen to govern. There were 5 patriarchs in Constantinople, Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. They are theoretically located in communities founded by apostles, but in reality, it was more that they were located in places that were nexuses of ideological, economic, or political power. This structure was strongly supported by Roman state power, and in turn, it ideologically justified the state and galvanized support at the local level. It should be said that most heresies in this first 1,000 years of the church died out during that period. But I would want to point out that it wasn't due to people being burned at the stake or anything, as would happen later. It was mostly people just being fired from religious or government jobs and not being able to have their ideas passed on. This is an abstraction and it's a lot more complicated, but this is sort of the way the Christian world looked just before the Islamic invasions. For our purposes, this is roughly correct. I made this in MS Paint. I think it's pretty. But what happened then when the Islamic invasions happened was that Nestorian regions fell under Islamic rule. Arian regions were conquered by the Catholic Franks. Ethiopian Orthodoxy was completely isolated from the rest of the Christian world for a very long time. And so that's sort of, as a result, you can sort of see what the implications are over here. Huge, the Nestorians and the Copts were occupied, and whatever divisions that existed in those areas, people tended to gravitate towards the largest sect or convert to Islam. You can see the communication issues for the Ethiopians, and then so it goes. So you ended up with the Nestorians and the Copts being smaller sects in occupied territories, and then the Orthodox in the east and the Latins in the west. Now, the Great Schism. I mentioned the 5 patriarchs. Rome claimed primacy above the other patriarchs because they were the place where Peter and Paul were martyred. They were the old capital. They're the only patriarch in the Latin-speaking West, and but their practical powers were very limited. And basically, they were the really only the first among equals as far as the other patriarchs were concerned. This dynamic really changed with the Islamic invasions because 3 of the 5 patriarchs went away. They were still around, but their power and influence had massively diminished. Meanwhile, Rome had made itself an independent city-state over the course of a few hundred years in there after the fall of the Western Empire, and this made a political split with the East basically inevitable. It did not mean that the Constantinople and Rome had different religious opinions at the time. The event officially designated as the breaking point happened in 1054. It was a minor political dispute. The Pope attempted to force southern Italian bishops to conform to Roman liturgical practices in areas that had only recently been ruled by the Byzantine Empire. The actual cause is fairly minor, but over time, after that happened, the patriarchs in Constantinople had other things going on, so did the popes, and people just never bothered to seal the breach, and these genuine religious differences grew up in the interim, in the gap, essentially. So we've got Eastern Orthodox, the Nestorians, the Ethiopians, the Copts, and the Catholic West. Also, Eastern Catholics exist, part of numerous attempts to seal the breach between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics. You can get they're in places like Ukraine and stuff like that, where they acknowledge the primacy of the Pope but follow Eastern liturgical practices. Fairly small, but they do exist. Okay, so the other great schism. We're fast forwarding by a few centuries here. By 1300, the popes had secured their position against in Europe against various threats that they had by leaning very heavily on French assistance. Italy itself was beset by internal divisions between cities, and within Rome there were aristocratic factions that fought for power. In Northern Europe, the Hundred Years' War was going on between France and England, and the French king was kind of a piece of work known as Philip the Fair. Philip wanted to tap into church funds for his war. The Pope said no. Philip killed him and had a French person elected as Pope instead. Philip suggested the Pope come to Avignon. It would be safer for him there because the mobs in Rome didn't like him. And then leaving became not an option. Amongst the things that happened as a result was Philip was able to physically threaten the Pope, and so when Philip wanted to shake down the Templar order for money, he was able to force the Pope to declare them heretics. There were no actual religious issues with the Templars. This is just they were declared heretics and their money was taken by Philip. This led to a very embarrassing schism. There were several attempts to heal it, notably at the Council of Pisa, where essentially the end result was that so basically sorry, I skipped a step here. No. So one of the popes eventually went back to Rome, started trying to fix the place up, and said, all right, I need to hop back to Avignon for a hot second, but I will be back. But then he died mysteriously, at which point the French bishops elected their own pope and the Italian bishops elected their own pope, and no one could agree on who was the right pope. So then the Council of Pisa was called, where the council elected another pope and tried to depose the other two, but those two refused to step down. So now there are 3 popes. Things are just getting worse. This 70-year-long the situation was now so silly as to be awkward even for the popes involved. And so a new council was called the Council of Constance, in which basically the Roman Pope and the Pisan Pope agreed to step down, and they eventually got the Avignon Pope to also step down, and a new Pope was elected. While they were there, the Council of Constance took care of a bunch of other things that had been going on, including condemning Jan Hus. Who's Jan Hus? There are a number of pre-Lutheran denominations of Protestants. The whole pre-Protestant thing is a very useful historical bit of nonsense. Wycliffe was an English academic at Oxford. Essentially, he argued that the church was corrupt, and that led him to question the need for clergy and all the stuff I have up on the screen. He was protected by a number of English nobles until there was a peasant revolt, and some of the peasants were echoing Lollard type ideas, at which point England kind of turned against him, or the English nobility turned against him. However, not before some of his works made their way to Bohemia, which is now Czechia. In Bohemia, they were found by one Jan Hus, who, scroll down, liked Wycliffe's ideas, started preaching them around, and ultimately ran afoul, because the world was split between these different popes. He was able to find a gap and slip between it. But once the Council of Constance came around, things, they were able to all agree that he was preaching heresy. So they demanded that he come to the council. His king gave him a promise of safe passage. However, once he got to the Council of Constance, he was condemned as a heretic and executed regardless of the safe passage. They probably thought that was it in the past. People like Jan Hus, you kill him and everything falls apart. But what actually happened was that the entire country of Bohemia rose in horrible, violent revolt. He was extremely popular. Representatives of the king were thrown out of a window. Anything foreign was horribly killed. 4 crusades were set against the country and were all crushed by Bohemian armies led by a one-eyed fanatic named Jan Ziska. Part of their success was that the Bohemians invented war carts loaded down with early gunpowder weapons and chain flails that acted as miniature mobile castles. They slaughtered Western knights in plate mail by the hundred. Meanwhile, small sects started springing up that argued that marriage had no biblical foundation, and that all people should share each other alike in common property. And huge portions of the country turned into massive orgies, which led to rounds of bloody infighting as these sects were put down by more moderate groups. All of which is to say that this whole situation was only ended when the Holy Roman Emperor signed a peace treaty with the Hussites that agreed to just let them do what they wanted. The Hussites, under the guise of the Moravian Church, are still around, and you'll find them around, but I'm pressed for time, so I'm moving on. Okay. Now, Luther and Zwingli and Calvin, oh my. I'm gonna have to speed up at this point. But you all probably know these stories are a little bit better known. Luther was fairly unhappy with the corruption of the church, and he nailed up his 95 Theses. Luther's big theological point was salvation by faith alone. Essentially, the Catholic Church, ever since Augustine, said that the way that you were saved was that you do good things, and God will reward good people by letting them into heaven. But humans are also deeply flawed and won't be able to earn God's love on their own unless they love God, for which God will forgive them. Things that count as good works are getting baptized, helping the poor, taking the Eucharist, donating to the church, and building the Pope a massive pleasure garden, at least according to the Catholic Church in the 1500s. Luther had some problems with some of this, and essentially ended up coming around to the idea that you didn't actually need to do those good things, you just needed to love God, and God would love you back, and everything would be fine. Again, don't have a lot of time to go into this. Listen to my show if you want to learn more. Luther was a little bit more successful than Hus. He got a bunch of German princes to physically protect him. So when he was called to the council and condemned as a heretic, a bunch of knights kidnapped him and spirited him out of town such that he couldn't be executed. this led to about 50 years of Cold War because the Holy Roman Emperor and the powers that be couldn't attack these princes because they were busy with the Turks. Now, Zwingli. Zwingli was a fairly extreme person who said that salvation by faith alone means transubstantiation isn't real, and he was something of an iconoclast. This was an issue because at the time that Zwingli, hi Duncan, at the time that Zwingli was preaching this, Luther was trying to make peace with the Catholics. He was trying to find a way that everybody could come together. And meanwhile, there's this guy over here saying that the Eucharist isn't real. However, it should be said that Zwingli also was fairly militant and ended up stoking a war between Protestant and Catholic cantons in Switzerland. The Catholic cantons were the ones that sent pikemen to be mercenaries, so they did a surprise attack on the Protestants and killed Zwingli. At which point Calvin showed up. God already knows. Calvin's big idea was predestination, which is a lot of fun. God already knows if you have faith because he gave it to you. So there's absolutely nothing you can do to make God save you, essentially. You should still do good things because that's what good people do, but you're going to be saved or not saved based on the merits that God gave you, and he already knows what they are. He also was a fairly radical person politically, which is very different from Zwingli and Calvin. Zwingli and Luther. Calvin, who was, basically ended up running a Swiss canton as a sort of a theocracy. He believed he was a Republican, essentially. He believed that society should be ruled by, a group of essentially electors who were voted on by members of the church, but membership in the church had to be screened to just believers. And so that gave the church itself an awful lot of power over who got to be in the church and therefore vote. He also had this very interesting idea that people with wealth and power got that way because God liked them. This would be developed later. Okay, back to Luther. And some talk about the national churches. Luther was a big fan of secular leadership. They gave him protection, after all. So the northern German princes in their areas had lots of trade ties to Scandinavia. So Lutheranism spread up that way. So at this point, as of 2023, as of right now, there is a Lutheran Church of Sweden, there's a Lutheran Church of Norway, there's a Lutheran Church of Finland. They believe basically the same things, but they're separate for political reasons. Henry, of course, if you watched the opening keynote, basically left the Catholic Church and created the Anglican religion because he needed a male heir. And also he wanted to confiscate church property and otherwise wanted to keep things the same. Ultimately, he sort of wanted to just be a Catholic, but be the one who was in charge. That didn't end up being what happened with the Anglican Church because of John Knox. He was a Calvinist true believer. He took advantage of the Scottish monarchy was in a lot of trouble at the time. There was basically a regency council. So John Knox showed up, and in the power vacuum, he started telling all the aristocrats, particularly the ones on the Regency Council, that they should actually be in charge and not kings and not bishops. The aristocrats liked that. And so basically, Scottish Parliament ruled and established a Calvinist kirk. And John Knox Scotland essentially moved really hard in a Protestant direction. I am skimming over a whole lot, but this is the origin of Presbyterianism. What presbytery is the individual church congregation, and essentially Knox was saying that should be the primary focus of the religion. And yes, there should also be some sort of higher level organization to keep everyone roughly in line, but that the main focus should be on the individual congregations. Given the time constraints, I'm going to skim this. The French Wars of Religion were a thing. Calvin himself was French, but there was a whole lot of dissent with the Catholic majority in France. It took them a real long time to finish this with a lot of atrocities on all sides. Suffice it to say that it took them until 1630 to finish getting rid of the Protestants in France. That's important. Because of the wars, the 30 Years' War. Again, really summarizing, the war started with the Protestant princes fighting against the Catholic princes of the Holy Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Emperor, the Habsburgs. Basically, it was a draw. Every time the Protestant princes got close to losing, the French, who were worried about being surrounded by the Habsburgs, despite their being Catholic, would give bags of money to someone to intervene in the war. So first it was the Danes, then the Swedish. Then, once they got to 1630, the Catholic French had wiped out their Protestant problem, so they joined the war on the Protestant side, like you do. The war was awful. Beyond the atrocities that are pictured, you also had the fact that these massive early gunpowder armies were washing across the continent without any kind of logistical system. So they were stealing food from the peasants, so everyone starved to death. All right, this is also insanely complicated, and I'm going to skim over this, but if you want to learn more about the wars of religion, the War of the Three Kingdoms, there's a number of shows you could listen to out there right now. Suffice it to say that the king side represented sort of the more conservative Anglican side, and Cromwell was represented a lot of what were called independents and religious dissenters. Ultimately, Cromwell won, and then everyone hated living under him, and so they brought back the monarchy after he died. Okay. So, right as that's happening, David, can I get a time check?
We got about 10 minutes total left, including time for Q&A.
Okay, great.
So if you could wrap up in a minute or two, that would be great.
Yep.
So far, there's only one question asked, though. So,
all right. I'll try and just get through these last few slides. So, all right. So there were a whole bunch of transatlantic religions that were caused by the Wars of Three Kingdoms. Anglicanism obviously was the main religion for most English people. Once you get to the War of the American Revolution, you can't really be the same religion anymore, so they split. But Episcopalianism basically is the same as Anglicanism. An episcopal is just a bishop. It's a Latin word for bishop. So what it's saying is that we have a church and we like bishops, as opposed to the Presbyterians who like congregations. The Congregationalists were the Puritans from the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, or the Pilgrims, if you like. Their word also means that they like congregations. There have been many attempts to bring together the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians over the years. Haven't really worked. They've undergone a really weird journey from being the conservative theocrats who burned witches to now being extremely liberal right now. The Quakers came from a group that existed during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, but hadn't quite settled on their theology yet. Essentially, they believed in no priests and no kings. They're pacifists. They came around to hating slavery eventually. Their big thing is that God is in all of us, and they believe they structure their worship services in such a way that there is no one leader. People will sit around in groups like this, and whoever is inspired to get up and talk does so. Baptists don't go quite that far, but they believe that infant baptism is unnecessary because obviously no choice is involved, and also that's a good work. So whatever your preacher thinks is good is good. The Methodists started out in England before the American Revolution, and they were just populists essentially. They used all sorts of tools to reach poor people where they were. This was particularly important in the Great Awakening, where they would go out into the countryside or go to coal mines or anything to preach to anyone who would listen. They became wildly popular, and they had a big effect on the psyche of the New World and England. After the Revolution, there was another Great Awakening, basically as these same the evangelists, who were very similar to the Methodists but without an organizational structure. The evangelists, the Methodists, and then the Congregationalists, who adopted the tools of the Methodists, went out into new frontier territories. They also recruited amongst Black people on plantations, which is how we get modern Black churches. The Great Awakening also led to the Adventists and the Mormons showing up. All right, let's just go straight to the Q&A. This was way too long.
I did nail my time prediction though.
What's that?
Anyway, the only question that I see is from Lynn Marie asking about the Cathars,
Yes.
whether they were a revival of the ancient Gnostics, or I guess anything else you have to say about them.
Yeah, so that's interesting. It's tough to say, really, because all we know about the Cathars is from the people who were killing them, and some of it's really wild. The best guess, the least sensational stuff we know about them suggests that, yeah, they were a Gnostic type of idea. Of course, the Gnostics weren't one unified group or theology, so that they sort of had their own special take on it, but by all accounts they were some sort of Gnostic. The real thing though with them is that there were, I sort of had to skim over this and cut it from the presentation, but there were three groups that were sort of started around all the same time: the Waldensians, the Franciscans, and the Albigensians. The main thing for all of them was criticizing church corruption. They went in three different directions. And while the Franciscans are now part of the Catholic Church and the Albigensians are all dead, the Waldensians are still around. They actually have official support from the Italian government.
There's a lot of comments cheering I mention of the Czechs.
Yes.
Some people saying hello to Duncan. Not a lot else. There's a lot of discussion and sharing of various sex facts.
It's important to talk about sex.
People counted your open browser windows. Apparently you had 68.
How you can see that.
And there was a lively discussion offsite on whether that was a lot or not a lot.
It's sort of organized.
For the record, I have 582. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you got me beat.
I'm on the that's not a lot, but I'm in the someone think of an outlier. All right, last chance for anyone who wants to ask Ben questions before he disappears forever. All right. Well, Ben is the host of the Wittenberg and Westphalia podcast, which you should check out for all sorts of great insights like this that have nothing to do with either Wittenberg or Westphalia.
We touched on Wittenberg this time, and we breezed past Westphalia at very high speed.
No, you really should have given a spoiler alert, though. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I will let you go. We do have some great talks coming up in the next 45 minutes. In room 2, this room, the cool room, we have Sarah of Rejects and Revolutionaries with a very timely talk on remember the 5th of November. There's also an ancient Persia panel. The partial historians are discussing an airy question. A lot of air related talks and inheritance related talks today. And for something completely different, in room 4, Advent of Computing is talking about how Intel's stopgap shaped modern computing.